welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. Today I'm going to be deep diving a little bit and I'll be talking about two different people. Well, one in particular today, but these two people are very different and seemingly unrelated people, but somehow they've converged. The first is a Ukrainian woman who was born in 1831. She's a woman who ultimately became one of the most influential mystics in modern history. The second is a German man who was only 2 years old when the woman finally passed away. This man has also gone down in history and probably has one of the most recognizable names in the entire world. Maybe he always will, but for very different reasons. What these two people, this man and this woman, who have never met, who only shared 2 years of life on Earth together, what they have in common is a book that was written back in 1877 and which discussed at great length topics of esoteric philosophy. And weirdly enough, this non-relationship between these two people, whose only thing in common is a book, is also speculated to have involved UFOs, aliens, and maybe even a secret society that's hidden in the polar ice caps somewhere today. And also the topic of whether or not there are maybe extraterrestrials working with humans in a secret society to develop a world of one world government to guide humanity into a new phase of existence. So this is going to be a very long and detailed story with lots of components. So get comfortable. I don't think I'll be able to finish it today. I think we'll probably just get through the woman and her background today. But you know what? Even if this discussion takes a few episodes, I think it's worth it. So let's start this off with the story of the girl who was born in what at the time was a region that formed part of the Russian Empire, but which is now known as Dnipro. Dnipro is today Ukraine's fourth largest city with a population of around 1 million people. It's located in the central eastern part of Ukraine, around 240 miles south of Ukraine's capital city, Kiev. On the day that this little girl was born, however, Dnipro had a different name. It was called Yekaterinoslav, which in Russian means the glory of Catherine, named after the Russian Queen Catherine. Archaeological evidence suggests that it was an area that was first settled by Cossacks and Cossack communities in around the early 1500s. The Cossacks were a violent and semi-militarized race of people. They were part Christian, part nomadic warrior from mixed Nordic and Eastern European ancestry. The Cossacks dominated the region for around 250 years, but in 1787, Yekaterinoslav was absorbed by force, of course, into Russia and was formally decreed to be the administrative center for the plans of the new government of a bigger and more powerful Russian Empire. A little girl by the name of Helena Petrovna was born around 40 years later into a prominent aristocratic family by the name of von Hahn. She was born on the 12th of August 1831. Helena's mother was also called Helena and was a renowned novelist, and Helena's father was a captain of artillery. Because of Helena's father's profession, Helena and her family moved a lot throughout her childhood years. And Helena also spent a number of years living with her grandparents after the untimely death of her mother in the 1940s. I think Helena was around about 11 or 12 when her mother died. Helena obviously was very young when this happened, but also the constant travel and the upheaval of her life that seemed to occur a lot in her youth, I think it perhaps affected her personality a little bit. She had quite a vivid imagination. She had spent a lot of time alone, but she also seemed to be very, very confident and very strong-willed. So she also grew up surrounded by esoteric philosophies. For example, in the region where Helena was born, the local people very strongly believed in nature spirits, witchcraft and magical customs and rites. Helena's birthday also happened to be on the one day in the year on which it was believed that that day was, the people who were born on that day were exempt from persecutions of nature spirits and goblins. This means that Helena was seen to be very special to the people around her. It resulted in her receiving some secret kind of education in occult lore from her local, quite superstitious nurses. She also was reported to have demonstrated considerable psychic abilities at a very young age. She saw and talked with natural spirits, for example. But also younger children used to gather around her because she delighted in being able to tell them weird and frightening tales of fearsome monsters and otherworldly creatures. She was quite a storyteller and quite vivacious in that respect. Helena's grandmother had a large collection of stuffed animals, and Helena would tell the other children these long, elaborate stories about the lives of those stuffed animals, which sounds really cute, actually. But also, as I'd mentioned earlier, Helena had a very willful manner about her as well, and what seemed to be a virtually uncontrollable temper. She passionately rebelled against all constraints or customs or expectations that were placed on her, and this was a characteristic that she showed throughout her life. It caused her a lot of criticism at times, but also a lot of scandal, particularly when she got older. The funny thing is, you could almost see her personality in the various pictures to be found on the internet about her today. So the person that I'm talking about, Helena Petrovna, is now known to us as Helena Blavatsky, the world-renowned mystic who founded the Theosophical Society, which is a worldwide society that was originated in London. The Theosophical Society is a society that hopes to learn from the experiences of the occult. And it all begins to make sense when you get to know Helena's background and childhood. So Helena's grandmother came from Rosicrucian Freemasonry background or heritage, dating back to the mid-18th century. She had inherited a massive private occult library of books from her father, and Helena spent much of her youth alone in her great-grandfather's library, lost in the seemingly endless supply of esoteric wisdoms at her disposal. What Helena found particularly enjoyable was reading about the secret societies surrounding Freemasonry and the many philosophies on how the world was formed and how it could be transformed in the future. But Helena's life took an unexpected turn when she was 17 years old. She had a governess who taunted her by saying that Helena would never find a man willing to marry her because of her temper and her willful nature. So in a fit of temper and willful nature, and to prove the governess wrong, Helena maneuvered herself very quickly and adeptly into the life of a man by the name of Nikifor Blavatsky. Nikifor was a civil administrator who was 3 times Helena's age. He literally did not see her coming, and before he knew it, he was married to her. It was now 1848, and the marriage very quickly turned into a bit of a disaster. I think it's been described as a massive disaster, actually. Now, a young 17-year-old girl marrying a man who's 40 wasn't particularly unusual at the time, and often it was done that way because the young girls were pretty, the older men had the means to be able to support them, and so this is the way that the young girls were married off. But Helena had only married out of anger, and also in the hopes that being married and away from the family home would possibly give her greater freedom in her life that she would have had as than she would have had as being a single woman. But she was kind of mistaken, because being a married woman also had its constraints, and so the marriage never really took off, and it wasn't even consummated. Within 3 months of being married, Helena fled her married home and disappeared to what is now Istanbul in Turkey. At the time, Istanbul was actually called Constantinople. So this sudden disappearing act changed Helena's life completely and forever. She was instantly separated from high society, the luxury and the indulgence of her family life. But she was free to travel to anywhere she wished and to study anything she wanted. And so she did. Helena spent the next 25 years traveling through Europe, Egypt, Greece, the regions of Eastern Europe, and then later through Canada, South America, and also the United States. There were periods of this time where she was being supported by family, where family did send her money. There were other periods of her life where her husband also sent her money. I don't know how she managed that, but there were also periods of her life during this travel where pretty much all contact with Helena was lost. But boy, she did have some stories to tell about all of those years, those 25 years. Stories that were so wild that even today she's very easily criticized as being nothing more than a storyteller. But the fact is that Helena was indeed an unusual woman for her time, and people who are unusual often encounter unusual things in their lives. What we know for sure is that it was those years during which Helena was traveling that seemed, and in which she was unreachable seemingly, that made her the person that she will always be known for in the world today, and maybe even forever. Accounts of Helena Blavatsky's life during this time explain that she was searching for occult knowledge, an understanding of the inner powers that exist between the humanity and the natural world. She wanted to pierce the mysteries of life, and she went on a search around the world for people and experiences that could help her to deeply penetrate those mysteries that she'd read about in her great-grandfather's library. Helena believed that humans have more power inside them than just the conventional wisdoms that we're allowed to understand or which have been traditionally taught to us. And so her travels were very unstructured, and she found herself visiting places and people that introduced her to things like sorcery, witchcraft, and magic, including black magic. By the time Helena had arrived in the Americas, she had also become acquainted with the concept of a new form of spiritualism that blended religious faith with something far more personal. This concept of spiritualism became the foundation of many of the books that Helena would go on to write in her later life. We also know that Helena lived for a time in London and also in Paris, but her record keeping of her travels was a bit haphazard, and many of her accounts of her experiences are uncorroborated. So it's actually quite difficult to know for sure when she was where and whether everything she claimed to be true actually was true. I do, however, think that it's a little bit unfair to label Helena Blavatsky a liar or just a storyteller. There clearly was more to her than that. She was an exceptional personality, and with an extraordinary drive to learn about something that was very specific. That kind of a person tends to achieve rather extraordinary things, and also tends to have a genuineness about the topic that drives them to learn more. So it was while Helena was living in London that she claims to have met a person that she refers to as her master. She met him in Hyde Park and described him to be a tall Hindu man. Now, let's stop for a second to remember something from a previous episode. 2 weeks ago, I did an episode about Benjamin Creme, who was the founder of Share International Foundation. Benjamin Creme refers to a group of masters, ascendant masters, the most ascendant of which is Christ, who embodied in a material human form in order to live his current days out in London. According to Share International Foundation, Christ continues to live in London today. If you haven't heard this episode, I suggest you catch up on it. The episode is called Brotherhood of the Lord's Kingdom, and it aired only 2 weeks ago. It could actually help with understanding the relevance of Helena Blavatsky's claims about her own ascendant master of Hindu origin. There's a lot of similarities there. Now, this master convinced Helena that she had a critical mission that needed to unfold that was ahead of her, and she was determined to fulfill this mission. But her master insisted that she must first travel to Tibet in order to do so. Now, Tibet was notoriously impossible for Westerners to be able to enter. It was a closed-off area of the world, and it was very secretive and very heavily guarded. It was highly unlikely that any Westerner would be able to move into Tibet at any time, but particularly in the 1800s, for a woman to be able to successfully do so was just unheard of. However, Helena was not an ordinary woman. When she decided she was going to achieve something and do something, she did it. And so off to India Helena went, with a view to continuing her travels into Tibet. Now, as you can imagine, it wasn't going to be that easy for Helena to be able to enter the mysterious Tibet. Her master had told her that she would receive crucial training in Tibet, and she was therefore determined to enter. But each time she tried over the next few years, her attempts were thwarted. There were also other things that didn't always go very smoothly for Helena in her travels either over that 25-year period. And they weren't always as you'd expect of a young woman from an aristocratic heritage. She briefly returned to Russia in 1858, and in 1859, at the age of 27, Helena was befallen by a terrible illness during her brief stay in Russia. But her return to her motherland also reactivated a number of the psychic phenomena that she had been known for during her childhood. I guess it may have had something to do with the area in which she lived, perhaps, or maybe the emotional sentiment that she had upon returning. Anyway, Helena's sister, whose name was Vera Petrovna de Zelachovsky, documented and described Helena's various supernatural abilities during this time. These included telepathy and telekinesis. Vera also claimed to have witnessed Helena being able to mediate between humans and otherworldly beings. After her recovery of that illness that she'd suffered upon her return to Russia, Helena's psychic powers seemed to magnify tremendously. She was considered by those around her to be a powerful psychic medium. So in around 1865, Helena left Russia and continued with her travels. She went to Italy, Eastern Europe, Egypt, and Persia, which is now known as Iran. She became friends with a member of an Italian society called Carbonari, which resulted in her joining the Garibaldi army, which was an army closely connected to the Carbonari society. She fought in the army, and in 1867, at the age of 37, she was wounded while fighting in the Garibaldi army during the Battle of Mentana in Italy. She sustained 3 gunshot wounds and was also stabbed in the chest, but she survived. Now, we are talking about an account of the events that Helena has described herself. However, what is known is that she did have injuries on her body that appeared to correspond with the types of wounds that she claimed to have received. So quite a miraculous recovery from an almost certain prospect of death. But one thing we also know about Helena Blavatsky then is that she sure wasn't a shrinking violet. She definitely got involved in life, by certain. Anyway, after living for a time in the Americas, Helena was again in Constantinople when she was summoned by her ascendant master. Together, they traveled through India, and this is where Helena claims that she met 2 other masters. One was called Kuthumi, and another was Master Moria. These were mystics who ran a school near the grand monastery of Tashi Lunpo and were believed to have possessed superhuman powers. They were given full access to the Tibetan monastery containing all of the sacred Buddhist literature that exists, and this was shared with Helena in the form of teachings to be shared with humanity. Helena was given the role of disciple, which is a person who was destined by her birth to reveal secret teachings to the world. Helena remained in the Tibetan Himalayas for the next 2 years and forever considered this time in her life to be the single most preparatory time of her life's spiritual enlightenment. It's also this time in which Helena claims that she was dictated the entire contents of one of her most profound books, one of the most profound that she'd written in her lifetime. The very same book that ultimately connected her to a man that hadn't even been born yet, but would later go on to become the most ruthless and feared tyrant ever known to the world. After leaving Tibet, Helena traveled to Cairo and founded a society called the Spiritual Society, or co-founded. The purpose of the society was firstly to investigate occult phenomena, which was something inspired by Helena's time living in the Americas. Secondly, the society was conducting secret occult rituals that were only known about by a very small number of members. There isn't very much known about what these rituals were all about, but it is speculated by some that the rituals were very similar to the kinds of rituals that were later conducted in the earliest period of operation for the Theosophical Society that would be founded by Helena or co-founded by Helena Blavatsky just a few years later. In the early 1870s, Helena's spiritual society ultimately disbanded, and Helena relocated back to the United States, where she lived in New York City. She began collating the works of the written word that she had compiled by telepathic instruction by her various mystical masters. There are people during this time that dismissed Helena's stories as being fantasies, delusions, or misguided constructs arising from the personification of spiritual concepts. Personifying a concept was something that had previously occurred in Freemasonry. It was like creating a history of biography of a person or an entity that didn't actually exist themselves, but with a physical description of an idea that has no actual physical form. And they thought that Helena was doing that. Many people also criticized Helena during this time, which, as we can imagine, probably just caused her to become even more defiant, because that was in her nature. But anyway, it didn't stop her from writing. And so she wrote and she wrote and she wrote. Helena wrote everything that she knew. She wrote everything that she had learned during the 25 years of travel that she had undertaken across all of the wisdoms that she'd learned and all of the spiritual concepts that she'd been taught by a number of different masters that she had met along the way. Because, after all, this was believed by her to be her critical mission in life. And if nothing else, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was determined to deliver on this critical mission. Spiritualist activity was thriving in America in the 1870s, and so despite the criticism from some, there were also many like-minded people in New York City, and it didn't take a very outgoing Helena long to find those like-minded people. One of the most significant new friendships that Helena made was with a man by the name of Henry Steele Olcott. Henry was a lawyer, but he was also very interested in spiritual phenomena in the nearby areas. Apparently at the time that Henry and Helena met, Henry was in the middle of investigating claims of phantom activity in a house in the nearby state of Vermont. Anyway, Henry Olcott and Helena Blavatsky joined forces and used their shared interest in the occult and the spiritual by co-founding the Theosophical Society. The way that this transpired was that Helena had become quite bored with what she believed was a rather superficial discussion about the spiritual or the occult that was happening with those around her in New York. Her travels and the messages that she had received had taken her down a much deeper path of wisdom than any of the people that she was encountering, and she was yearning to develop this wisdom even further. Helena considered that the American spiritualist movement was lacking depth. She began to reject the chatter around her and instead turned to more ancient writings of philosophy and then also about recently found bodies of text that had occurred during that time. For example, one of these texts that had been recently found were the pyramid texts, which were found in the pyramids of Egypt in the late 1800s. These texts are among the oldest religious writings in the world, dating back to around 2400 to 2300 BC. They were inscribed on the walls and inside tombs found in or near the pyramids, and they contained spells and incantations intended to protect the pharaohs in the afterlife. Helena had been conferring with spirit beings and her masters, and it was this that she combined to begin developing her own doctrines, which were firmly rooted in far more ancient esoteric traditions from around the West and around the world. In the beginning, she tried to make her ideas public through writing in a spiritualist scientific type of magazine. She wrote extremely well, and her articles began to attract groups of people who were curious to find out more about the occult. Helena started hosting gatherings in her apartment in New York City. People in attendance would regularly be lawyers, academics, religious publishers, and spiritualists. Helena was slowly becoming the hottest thing in town, spiritually speaking, at around this time. After attending a lecture by a Kabbalistic Freemason by the name of George Felt, Henry Olcott one day suggested to Helena that it might be a nice time to expand on the work that they were both doing by founding a society that would be dedicated to studying the occult. Henry Olcott took on the role of president of the society. George Felt became vice president, and Helena Blavatsky worked as secretary. The name of the society was the Theosophical Society, and that name was chosen because the word Theosophia was an ancient Greek word meaning wisdom of God. The society had 3 high-level objectives, which can be summarized, I guess, as follows. Objective 1 was to form a universal brotherhood with a single set of purposes to guide them. There would be no distinctions made as to race or creed or social standing, and each member of the brotherhood would be judged on their individual merit. Objective 2 was to study the philosophies of the East, in particular India, and to present those philosophies to the public in ways that would interpret what humanity already knows in new esoteric ways. And objective 3 would be to transcend beyond the dogma of established religious doctrine or material principles and into the forces that are unknown or unrecognized by science and which occur in nature and in the presence of psychic and spiritual powers available but untapped inside humanity. Helena Blavatsky, during her travels, had become absolutely convinced that this notion of Egypt being the foundational element of all esoteric and spiritual awareness was incorrect. She believed that the earliest period of time and the earliest location that was foundational for all of this ancient wisdom was actually India. She took a tremendous amount of interest in India, I guess perhaps because of those 2 years in the Tibetan Himalayas. And this was part of one of the reasons why India featured very strongly as a center of knowledge and wisdom and those Eastern spiritual concepts that were part of the founding principles of the Theosophical Society. So it all sounded wonderful. And I kind of wish, to be honest, that I'd been around then to be one of the early members. But in reality and in truth, the whole idea of the Theosophical Society in the beginning, it flopped terribly. Spirituality in America at the time was all about spirits of the dead and how to contact the spirits of the dead and mediumship. And it was very one-dimensional considering what we think of spiritualism these days. And in fact, once the Theosophical Society began conducting its early meetings and publishing written works, the established spiritualists in America that had signed up early to the society, they started leaving the society because they disagreed with the principles. They didn't like hearing what was being offered to them as a truth because people are people, and as we know, people hate hearing the truth. Tell me about it. I'm sure we've all had first-hand examples of that in our lives. Sometimes people are so married to what they think they already know that hearing the truth actually hurt their ears. They're outraged by it, and that's exactly what happened here. For a period of time in the beginning, things got a little bit shaky at the Theosophical Society, but Helena, Henry, and George stuck with it. And as time continued to move forward, they were able to begin attracting a whole new generation of members. people who were hungry for more and whose hearts and minds were open to the unknown, untapped wisdoms of the ages. One of the most notable members at this time was a fellow that perhaps we've all heard of, and that's the great Thomas Edison. In her early days in New York, around the time of the founding of the Theosophical Society, Helena had written a book. The book was called Isis Unveiled, and it was published by the Theosophical Society's publishing arm, which, believe it or not, was called Lucifer Press. Lucifer Press is now known as Lucis Trust. The name change was made to better reflect the organization's focus on spiritual enlightenment and the dissemination of esoteric knowledge. Lucis Trust continues today to publish work that's related to spiritual topics, even now. Isis Unveiled was a massive book, almost 1,300 pages in total, and it created a kind of middle ground between the established Judeo-Christian philosophies that underpin the Abrahamic religions of the Western world and the ancient Eastern wisdoms arising from Asia and the Middle East. Today, when we think of the esoteric practices and principles that impact spiritualist thinking, we're often repeating concepts that have been developed as a result of Helena Blavatsky's own doctrines as outlined in Isis Unveiled and her subsequent writings. So think about that. The spiritualist activities and topics that you're working with or thinking about or listening to right now, they come originally, potentially from her book. So let's recap a little bit about what Isis Unveiled was all about. The book was originally called The Veil of Isis, but it had to be renamed when Helena discovered that a book with the same name had been published only 15 years earlier by a Rosicrucian by the name of W. Reed. However, despite the title being changed, the original title of The Veil of Isis continued to appear in print at the top of each page of the book. It was just officially renamed in order to avoid confusing Helena's book with that of Reed's. Isis Unveiled consists of 2 volumes. Volume 1 discusses occult science, the hidden and unknown forces of nature, and it explores things like the psychic phenomena and what it calls the inner and outer man. Volume 2 is all about the similarities between Christian theology and Eastern religions, such as Buddhism, Hinduism, and others. It follows a retro path from the current understanding of Judeo-Christian theology back to the idea that all religions purportedly descend from a common source, which Helena described to be the wisdom religion. In the preface of the book, Helena wrote that Isis Unveiled is, and I quote, a plea for the recognition of the Hermetic philosophy, the anciently universal wisdom religion, as the only possible key to the absolute in science and theology, unquote. Helena's Isis Unveiled created a symphony between Christianity, the occult, scientific theories such as Darwinism and the Darwinistic theories of evolution, and blended them into an argument that strongly defied the findings of traditional scientific explanations about the origins of humanity. I actually remember recently listening to a podcast referring to Helena Blavatsky as being too chubby to be a woman traveling the world alone in the mid to late 1800s. I have to say I couldn't help it, and I went to go find photos of the podcaster, who also, it turns out, happened to be a little chubby. I guess she must have been somewhat a different kind of chubby to Helena, and so was speaking from personal experience, perhaps. There are, of course, chubby girls who sit around judging others, and this is something that I feel very strongly opposed to. And there are chubby girls who take the bull by the horns and make stuff happen. As a chubby girl myself, who has lived in multiple countries and navigated more than one risky circumstance in my life, including paving my own driveway, building my own garden shed, and having personally walked up the thousands of stairs that it took to get to the Holy Trinity Monastery in Meteora in Greece, I can vouch for the fact that not all chubby girls are useless. And if they are the kind of chubby girl that Helena Blavatsky proved herself to be, even just with the wisdom that she shared in later life with the world, then you know what? Hail to the chubby girl. If only the world had more chubby girls like Helena, maybe stuff would finally get done. So there, I've said my piece. By the way, after all those stares at the Holy Trinity, I wasn't even allowed to go inside the monastery because, as it happens, I was only wearing a tank top at the time and I didn't have anything to cover my shoulders, and you had to have covered shoulders in order to get into the monastery. So after all those stairs, and I swear there were more than 1,000, I couldn't get in. Bummer dude. Anyway, so before we move on from Helena's first book, it should be mentioned that modern theosophists hold the book Isis Unveiled in such high regard as to refer to it as a revelatory work that was dictated to Helena Blavatsky by an ascendant master, also known to be a human entity so evolved in its existence that its purpose now is to help guide humanity towards its own collective evolution. That's a big deal. So in 1879, Helena Blavatsky and Henry Olcott left New York City. According to Henry's own personal diary, Helena began writing at this time what would be considered by many around the world to be her greatest written work. This was the book that she wrote called The Secret Doctrine. The Secret Doctrine was published by Lucifer Press in 1887. By this time, Helena was living in London and also spent some time living in Würzburg in Germany. She embarked on a project to revise Isis Unveiled, but pretty soon after beginning that endeavour, it became clear that she was indeed writing an entirely new book. The Secret Doctrine was yet again a 2-volume publication, and it was even longer than Helena's first book, Isis Unveiled. In fact, I think it was about 1,400 to 1,500 pages in length. It discussed the nature of reality, both material and spiritual. It also focused on the origins and destiny of humanity. An extract from the preface of her book shows that Helena wrote the following, and I quote, "The aim of this work may be thus stated, to show that nature is not a fortuitous occurrence of atoms, and to assign man his rightful place in the scheme of the universe. To rescue from degradation the archaic truths which are the basis of all religions, to uncover to some extent the fundamental unity from which they all spring, and finally to show that the occult side of nature has never been approached by science or modern civilization." So let me just stop there for a moment, and then I'm going to continue with more that I can quote from what she wrote. Helena was saying that there's more to the creation and evolution of humans than science, and that the evolution and creation of humans has nothing to do with what science claims took place. That there's older wisdom that actually demonstrates that humanity came about in an entirely different way. Now, this was being written in the mid to late 1800s. And a lot of what we have discovered since then demonstrates that Helena either was fantastic at guessing what would be found in later years, or perhaps was psychic and had a knowing about it well in advance, or perhaps the wisdom she had been taught was genuine wisdom, something true from a real master who actually had knowledge. Because over the years, since the 1880s, humanity has found numerous written or otherwise documented works that demonstrate that that section of the preface written by Helena Blavatsky is correct. So let me continue with what else she's written. So once again, I'm quoting, "These pages were not written for the masses. They're neither an appeal for reform nor an effort to win over, to our view, the fortunate of life. They are addressed solely to those who are constitutionally able to comprehend them, to those who suffer, to those who hunger and thirst after some reality in this world of Chinese shadows." So in this section, Helena is actually saying that she knows that she's not the only person on earth who knows that there's more than what we are supposed to know, what we're traditionally being taught, and what's written in the Abrahamic religion or religious doctrines. She knows that there are people who know that there's more, and that this text is to allow them to feel comfort in the understanding that she also knows that there's more and that they're not alone. It just goes to show, I think she was, at the very least, a very enlightened person. So in The Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, it discusses the birth of and subsequent development of the cosmos, its spiritual origins, cyclical processes and laws, and its hierarchical structure. The second volume, Volume 2, deals with the birth of humanity and its evolution during millions of years on this planet. Things that we've discovered since then. Isn't that interesting? At the beginning of today's episode, I mentioned that I was going to be talking about two people, though. Helena Blavatsky is obviously the woman that I referred to as the woman, but the man hasn't yet been discussed, and I think we're going to have to extend this discussion into next week, because there is still so much to be said before I even get to the dude in the story. But at this point in Helena's story, the connection between her and the man that was yet to be born is sort of conceptualized. And for those who haven't guessed it yet, the man that I'm talking about is Adolf Hitler. So Helena Blavatsky's book, The Secret Doctrine, whilst discussing the creation of the cosmos and the creation and destiny of humanity, also delves into the esoteric concept of what Helena describes to be the 7 root races of humanity. The 7 root races are explained to be stages in the spiritual and physical evolution of mankind. So let's give these 7 stages a bit of time to digest here, because they're going to be a very important part of what I'm talking about in next week's episode. So let's go through each of these stages and take a closer look. So the first root race in Helena's theory is described to be an ethereal and non-physical form of human. In its first root race form, humanity is composed of pure light and energy. It consisted of shadowy, astral types of beings who were more like projections than physical entities. Characteristics of the first root form of humans included those who were self-born, so I guess they had somehow created themselves, but they lacked any kind of understanding of life or language or any kind of cognitive abilities. They were also sexless, and whilst they did reproduce, this was through a process of fission, like being able to split into multiple created beings, sort of like a virus multiplies. It splits and it multiplies. Like humans do actually act like a bit of a virus sometimes, so I guess it makes sense to think of us as coming from a viral type of beginning. Now, this theory of the first root race is not unlike the modern theories of humans evolving from a single cell organism, which was discussed in earlier episodes here on this show. And also, in another recent episode, I've discussed the concept that the human ascension and our reaching of the 5th dimension. I wondered about how Adam and Eve were punished for eating from the tree of knowledge. Now, if you'll recall, for a moment, it occurred to me in that episode that perhaps the problem there had been that they were meant to be a different dimension, perhaps even just a first or second dimensional being. And if that was the case, and if eating from the tree of knowledge gave them this third dimensional existence, then it could actually correspond with this first root race that's being discussed by Helena in the book. I had speculated at the time as to whether the intention had been for Adam and Eve to be first dimensional beings or second dimensional beings, and that this wisdom that they had eaten from the tree had allowed them to be more, and that was the reason why they were punished. It's funny how all these little ingredients of things that I'm talking about on the show, they all just seem to circle back into one another, doesn't it? It's really interesting. Anyway, I'm sure with time we will discover even more overlaps between the various different episodes, and I can't even keep up with them all. But for now, let's just carry on. It should also be said that Helena's book described this first root race of humans to have lived in a location called the Impenetrable Sacred Land, which is believed to be located at the current North Pole, like where Santa lives. So that was the first root race. So let's have a look at the second root race. These were a race of early humans called the Hyperboreans. They were still ethereal in nature but had begun to develop some forms of physical characteristics. Perhaps they were kind of shifting from being a first dimensional to a kind of second dimensional being, perhaps. I don't know. They lived in what the book describes to be a land of eternal spring, a bit like the Garden of Eden, maybe. You see, the more I study the Bible and then all of the other alternative sources of knowledge pertaining to spirituality and ancient philosophy and even the alien life theories, the more these little nuggets of sameness seem to crop up. Everything is being called different names depending on where it's being written and who writes it, but this is a perfect example. If the Garden of Eden described in the Bible's Old Testament, is anything, well, it would definitely be like a land of eternal spring, wouldn't it? Because the definition of spring is that the natural landscape is lush with fresh bloom and budding vegetation, just like the fertile abundance of Eden. I don't know about you, but I find these little weird nuggets of sameness to be very, very interesting. I just can't help myself. I just feel like we're really onto something here. So this second root race, or Hyperborean race as mentioned, had golden yellow bodies, and they reproduced by basically laying eggs. They exuded a bodily fluid that formed into an egg-shaped ball, which provided a type of external vehicle from which a fetus could develop, like those old external modems that you'd get for your computer when the internet was first a thing. To be honest, this kind of reproduction sounds like a wonderful way to have a baby. No physical discomfort for the mother, and if she wants to pop out for an evening of drinking and dancing, she can leave the fetus in its egg-like form at home to be looked after by dad. It sounds perfect to me. Anywho, by this time, humans had moved into areas of the planet that are now considered to be northern Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Scandinavia, and northern Russia. So now we've done the first root race, the second root race. Let's have a look at the third root race. This is the first evolution of humanity into a being that consisted of a fully developed physical form. We know of these human ancestors as the Lemurians. The Lemurians were initially androgynous, and then as time passed, they eventually evolved into a sexually differentiated set of genders. In the earlier period, they reproduced through a process called sweat-born. The sweat-born process was very much like that earlier stage of reproducing through a kind of an egg or a ball that could be develop a fetus outside of the mother's body. As the Lemurians evolved, however, they eventually began to reproduce through sex in the very same way that humans do today. Lemurians lived on what is referred to as the lost continent of Lemuria, which is believed to have been located in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So the fourth root race following that, and I'm taking you right back to episode 1 of this show when I'm talking about this, the episode called Convergence, where I talked about the ancient Greek philosophers and in particular the works of Plato. Well, Plato mentioned the Atlanteans, and these Atlanteans are the fourth root race that's described by Helena's secret doctrine. The Atlanteans were the first completely human species, just like we are now, but obviously probably a little different, because everything changes with time, as we know. But the Atlanteans had fully formed human bodies. Their sexual development was complete, just as completed as it is now, but they were very highly developed both spiritually and technologically. In fact, the Atlanteans were described to have possessed a very strong psychic ability. They lived on the continent of Atlantis, which is believed to be somewhere in the Atlantic near the Mediterranean regions. Atlantis is believed to have sunk into the ocean after what is debated to be either a series of natural disasters or self-destruction through war and technological experimentation, or even a combination of all of these things. And so that brings me to the fifth root race, which in Helena's book is considered to be the stage that humanity is currently in. The key characteristic of this stage in humanity's evolution is the development of our intellect. So the fifth root race was described in Helena's secret doctrine as being an Aryan race. But in order to understand what that means, we need to get to the core of the language that was being used in this description. These days, describing yourself to be an Aryan race member is probably going to make you look like a white supremacist, because you probably would be a white supremacist if you're describing yourself to be an Aryan race member, because it's a term that's used currently to describe someone as being superior to another person of a different cultural identity. But at the time of Helena's writing, Aryan was a word derived from Indo-Iranian terminology relating to nobility. But this is something that's going to be relevant in next week's discussion, because the word Aryan might have come from an Indian or Middle Eastern origin, but it sure was distorted over time, and it took us to an entirely different set of discussions about humanity and its place in the cosmos. I'll talk about that in more detail next week. For now, however, let's just know that the Aryan stage of humanity managed to develop advancements in intellectual capabilities very rapidly, and also spread throughout the world, with significant population growth, in particular occurring in Asia and Europe. So according to the secret doctrine, that's where we currently are in humanity's evolution right now. But there are still two root race stages left to go. Let's look at these both now. The sixth root race is a future evolutionary development described in Helena's book. It's expected to be more spiritually advanced than we currently are. It will possess higher consciousness and greater harmony with the universe. It will also revert backwards in some ways, back to the ethereal formlessness and also the androgyny of sex and gender, moving away from physical reproduction, just like the earlier root stages. This stage of humans will emerge from the Aryan stage and will spread across the globe, leading to the seventh root race of humans. And then finally, the seventh root race stage is the final stage, which has achieved a perfect balance of spirit and matter. In this stage, humans will be highly spiritual beings, living in a state of enlightenment and unity. There was very little detail provided about how the seventh root race would reproduce, but they will be capable of achieving outcomes that defy current physical laws of nature. The secret doctrine describes this stage of humanity's development to be far off in the distant future, as something that will represent the complete culmination of the human experience and of human evolution. So we are currently well past the halfway point and are sitting in the fifth stage of evolution, according to Helena Blavatsky's book. And it's funny because as I was compiling my research for today's episode, I kept coming across people who were experts. And for those who are listening on audio, I just want you to know that I air quoted the word experts. People who profess to be experts talking about how Helena Blavatsky referred to the fifth root race Aryans as being Anglo-Saxons specifically. These particular experts obviously haven't read The Secret Doctrine, because that's not what Helena Blavatsky wrote at all. She didn't differentiate between Anglo-Saxons and other ethnic races of humans. In fact, Helena did assign the term Aryan to include ethnic races that might slap a few white supremacists squarely in the face. For example, on page 78 of the book, she refers to Aryan Hindus. And on page 79, the Egyptian Aryans. On page 126, she refers to the various different groups of Aryan races and includes Asians, Europeans, Greeks, and Egyptians as examples. it's actually more likely than not that if Helena Blavatsky was talking about a single Aryan ethnic originating factor, it probably would have been Asian, and specifically the Hindu groups inside India. For anyone who wants to check my work on this, you can read the entire book for free on archive.org. You can even search the book's entire contents for keywords and other stuff, which is exactly what I did. So I guess all that can be said to the arguments being made about a superior white race based on the claims that the Aryans were and are such a race is, well, bummer, dude. Claims to fame instantly dissolved, but that's for another day. For now, let's finish up our discussion on the Secret Doctrine book because it really is a fascinating read. Helena also expanded upon her concepts that she had introduced in her first book, Isis Unveiled, where she talked about a cosmic hierarchy of beings that exists throughout the universe. In The Secret Doctrine, she described a group of super-intelligent beings, ascendant masters, in fact, who are responsible for overseeing and guiding the evolution of the universe, just like what's stated by Share International Foundation. And that, of course, includes the evolution of humanity, but not just humanity. And in this instance, Helena crosses over into so many of the other topics that we've been examining in this show every week. It seems, perhaps, that there might just be a group of cosmic caretakers who derive from any variety of places and many different types of races, but whose mission it is to keep everything moving forward in an evolutionary sense. We're going to talk about even more of that in the future. The more I researched about Helena Blavatsky, however, for this show, the more convoluted all of the historical accounting is. It seems that many of the books that were written about Helena Blavatsky were written by people who injected their viewpoints into the discussion, and they relied on the accounts of third-party people. There were, for example, a group of former colleagues at the Theosophical Society who produced documents demonstrating that Helena Blavatsky was a fake psychic who was planting strands of her hair or torn up sheets of paper around the world so that she could then prove that she knew where something was and then have someone find it and declare that it's a psychic prediction and all kinds of things like that. But all of these accounts come from third parties. There is a lot of mystery around Helena Blavatsky, and it's easy to determine that she was a fake, that she was a crackpot, that she was a con woman, or that she was just mistaken. However, what she did appear to do was write two very influential, detailed books that rely on the amalgamation of wisdom from all over the world, from places that people say she couldn't possibly have been to because she was just too chubby to do it on her own. That bit really stuck with me. That bit really stuck with me. It really irritated me. It's such a simple-minded and superficial thing to say. There are also many people who make judgments as to whether or not Helena Blavatsky was an honest person or whether she was just a grifter. And a lot of this appears to be based on the general consensus that women in the 1800s were supposed to be a certain way. And if they weren't that way, then there must have been a character flaw that made them highly promiscuous or a grifter or something like that. There has been speculation that Helena made her, she financed her overseas travel by being a prostitute. I don't think I have ever heard of any prostitutes in the 1800s who made enough money to be able to travel the world, but that's one of the speculations. She also claimed to be celibate and have never had sex, and also to live a virtuous lifestyle, but she was known as being a prolific smoker, someone who smoked many cigarettes per day, or tobacco. I don't know if they were cigarettes back then, but she smoked a lot of tobacco during the day. And she also claimed to be a teetotaler, someone who never drank alcohol, but she was rumored to have taken opioids and other types of mind-enhancing drugs. So there is so many questions about Helena Blavatsky. But she certainly did live an extraordinary life. And even when you look at her photos, most of which are photos from later life, you can see that there's more to her than would appear in the average woman of that time. I'm willing to give her the benefit of the doubt because she has been so influential, and she was also the first when it came to opening our minds to so much about what could be possible. Helena Blavatsky began exhibiting symptoms of influenza on April 26th, 1891, and just a few weeks later, on the 8th of May 1891, she died at the age of 59. Although the final 17 years of her life were an incredibly productive time, they were also very tumultuous. There were many allegations of fraud, plagiarism, as well as lawsuits that were brought against Helena Blavatsky. Even now, she has her staunch critics who claim that she was a fraud, a quack, a charlatan, or even just insane. But she didn't write like an insane person. In fact, the portions of her book that I've read so far are articulate and highly informed. Her ability to synthesize and eloquently articulate the knowledge that she passionately believed would bring about the evolution of humanity was one of the main reasons after her passing that more than 100 notices appeared in the British press to commemorate her life and her death. That's pretty impressive. The ancient wisdom of Helena's ascendant masters that she believed was her destiny to share with humanity has continued to provide a foundation for what was once called the New Age movement. But that's probably an old term now. Now, I'm not even sure what to call it. New Age science or something, I don't know, because it's something that even rivals modern day physical science in its credibility from time to time. And when I say that, what I mean is that today there are more people in the world who believe that something exists beyond our scientific knowledge and our proof of science than those who believe in science alone. And it's largely thanks to Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's life and the translation of her life experiences into the written works that provide a broad base of insight that makes personal beliefs something that every person in the world can uniquely possess as their own. So in next week's episode, we're going to return here to learn about the impact that Helena's work had on the world after it was captured and distorted by a bitter group of men determined to resurrect themselves after a shocking and humiliating defeat. And what I'm talking about here are the Nazis and Adolph Hitler. We're also going to talk about how the whole thing mingled together to bring us the new cultural shift into a world in which UFOs and extraterrestrial encounters are increasingly evolving into mainstream discussion and the concepts of human evolution. That was a wild journey, wasn't it? My name is Ellie, and you can find me at Ellie Dreams Down Under on YouTube. I'm currently on the hunt for informed individuals who can help to shed light on the evolution of humanity in any area or topic that it might relate to, whether it be science, religion, faith, the supernatural, the paranormal, psychology, you name it. Get in touch by email at elliedreamsdownunder@gmail.com and let's see if we might discuss some of these concepts on a future show. Thanks to everyone who's listening on one of KGRA's broadcasting platforms. If you'd like to hang out and watch any of the KGRA shows with like-minded experiences, spiritualists and weirdos like me, then go grab your membership at live.kgradb.com and use promo code Ellie to get 30% off your subscription. That's it for today. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.